Thus far, we have looked at the life of Muhammad, a very brief history of Islam, and then we have zeroed in on the basic doctrines of Islam, the fundamental tenets, specifically the 5 pillars of Islam. Now I would like for us to take a few moments to take a quick and brief look at some of these specific incidents in the life of Muhammad that merit consideration. Number 1, it might be a shock to many Americans and certainly to the Christian mind to learn the history of Muhammad's own involvement in bloodshed and warfare. History records, Islamic history records, that Muhammad personally led 27 military campaigns in which there was hard fighting. He personally planned and authorized some 38 additional military campaigns. In fact, when he participated in the elimination of Jewish tribal opposition in Medina, on one occasion they finally subjugated one of the Jewish fortresses and brought the men out, some 700 or 800, and beheaded all of those men starting in the morning and completing the beheadings by torchlight that evening. So Muhammad was personally involved in a great deal of bloodshed. I ask you this question: do you remember how many armies Jesus himself led into battle? And of course the answer to that is 0. What a contrast between Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and Muhammad, who claims to represent the God of the Bible. Secondly, it is equally shocking, at least, to the Christian moral mentality to learn not only of the doctrine of polygamy taught explicitly in the Quran, which we'll look at in a later session, but to come to find out that Muhammad himself had as many as 12 wives. I mentioned to you that he married Aisha, who was offered to him in marriage at the age of 6, although Muslim sources say that consummation of that marriage did not occur until the young lady was 9 years of age. In fact, Sahih al-Bukhari's hadith report this, narrated by Aisha, that her mother informed her that she was in fact engaged to Muhammad as a girl of 6, and then later was taken to him as a girl of 9 years of age. So there's abundant historical Islamic evidence. We're not talking about outsiders, we're talking about Islamic sources themselves verifying that point. Then there was the incident with Zainab, in which Muhammad's stepson got the impression that perhaps Muhammad was interested in his wife, and so very dutifully he divorced her so that she might then be married to Muhammad, and so he added her to his harem. And you know, the typical Muslim response to this is that, well, Muhammad was the prophet, and so even though the Quran limits a man to up to 4 wives at a time, although it has a very lax view of divorce, but 4 wives at a time, the reason why Muhammad could have as many as 12 was simply because he was the prophet, and most of his marriages were due to political reasons, to promote social reform, perhaps to marry war widows. But of course, none of those explanations fit the rational concept that if God authorizes polygamy, then He would authorize it for all men. He would not be a respecter of persons. And He would certainly not show partiality to a prophet over the average individual. So again, rather shocking to the Western mind, whose moral sensibilities have been fashioned and shaped by New Testament thinking. Another very unusual circumstance associated with Muhammad's personal life is the fact that there was a time in his life when he became ill, literally deathly ill. He was on his deathbed. And he claims that as his health continued to deteriorate, and nobody seemed to know what was wrong with him and why he was dying, he claims that he was visited by angelic beings who informed him that the reason why he was ill was because 2 Jewish sorceresses had cast a spell on him. They had in fact somehow come into possession of several of Muhammad's hairs, which they had taken, tied in knots around a palm branch, and breathed imprecations on those, curses that would bring about the ill health of Muhammad, and then they had thrown it into a dry well. And as Muhammad became sicker and sicker, it wasn't until these angelic beings came, explained why he was suffering this terrible malady, which then enabled him to instruct his followers to go to the dry well. And he claims that Allah gave him verses which now compose the last two surahs of the Quran. Those combined verses were uttered at the location of that palm branch where the knots were tied, and as each verse was uttered, a knot would untie. And once all of the knots were untied, Muhammad recovered from this dreaded illness. Now, the Bible talks about people believing in spells and mystical things, but it never dignifies it by giving the impression that there's anything to that. But notice it in this incident in Muhammad's life. Muslims believe this all really happened, and the Quran gives its sanction and endorsement to it by having two surahs out of 114 of them that authenticate the event and claim that the occurrence really took place. Another event in Muhammad's personal life that surely raises some eyebrows. Do you understand that early in Muhammad's life, as he was launching Islam among his Arabic neighbors in Mecca, do you understand that he believed that Allah wanted him, when he prayed, to face Jerusalem? And so he and his fellow Muslims did so for a lengthy period of time. And then there came a point at which he claims to have received a revelation from Allah, Surah 2, that told him he could now change direction from Jerusalem to Mecca. Now that raises questions. Why Jerusalem? Why was he facing Jerusalem to begin with? And why would God change that to Mecca? Of course, the whole question of whether God would even have anybody point a certain place on earth. Since God is not on earth, God is not confined to buildings, temples made with hands, the Bible teaches. And while there was a momentary period where God, strictly for the Jews, not for the rest of the world, had a central worship shrine in order to carry out certain specific rituals associated with Judaism, that's not the worldwide religion of Christianity that God intended to supplant and replace all other religions. But for suddenly Muhammad to be told, okay, now you may turn and change to Mecca, that seems rather odd. It even suggests that the initial direction was perhaps an attempt to appease or to convince those who believed Jerusalem to be a critical location, to prove to them that he was associated with that, but when it became clear they rejected him, then he suddenly receives revelation that allows him to turn toward his hometown, where the Quran says he wanted to turn all along. Well, these are events in the life of this individual. I'm not bringing these up in order to discredit Islam, but I think they raise serious questions that merit further attention, further perusal. Now, let me turn to one other incident in the life of Muhammad that well deserves our attention. Al-Miraj. This was that event that Muhammad claims occurred when he made a trip into heaven, into the very presence of Allah. I do not mean that he died and went to heaven. I mean that he made a trip to heaven and then returned to earth and continued living his life. No doubt you have seen images of this great structure. We call it the Dome of the Rock. It is in fact a Muslim mosque that was built in the 7th century by one of the Umayyad caliphs, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. He commenced work on the Dome of the Rock. It was completed sometime later, but perhaps you've never had anyone explain to you. Why is this mosque located where it is? Why is it located on what Jews would view as the temple platform, where the Temple of Solomon once sat? Is this just another mosque among scores, hundreds of mosques that are situated around the world? Oh, I assure you it is not. It has a very special history. If you could go to this mosque and look at a cross-section and see how it's constructed, it's composed with an outer octagon. If you were to step inside of the mosque, you would encounter yet another octagonal arcade. And then in the very center of the mosque is a highly ornate inner circular arcade. And if you could step to that location and then look up from the center, you would see beneath this massive dome, you would see literally gold embedded in the dome. And then directly beneath this lofty gold dome, which is in the very center of the mosque and which is the location for which the mosque was constructed, you would find a massive ledge rock. Muhammad, according to Muslims, stood on this noble rock and from there ascended into heaven in order to meet with Allah. Let me tell you the story, and I want to assure you, I have no ulterior motive. I have no desire to misrepresent any of the details of this story. I have gone to Islamic sources themselves, and I am now attempting to recreate for you this incident as true and accurately as I possibly can. Muhammad claims that on one occasion he was having trouble sleeping at night. Consequently, he got up, he walked to the Kaaba, and lay down outside of the Kaaba, there in the mosque vicinity, the vicinity of the Kaaba, and fell back asleep. Suddenly, he was awakened. Someone was tapping him. When he opened his eyes, he saw that it was the angel Gabriel. And Gabriel was accompanied by a very odd creature. It wasn't a horse. Muhammad called it a heavenly winged steed of some sort. He didn't know what species it was, but it had 2 wings, and this creature had a name. Listen carefully to my pronunciation of the Arabic. Barak. Barak. Muhammad claims that Gabriel instructed him to mount Barak, which he obediently did. And then with Muhammad astride Barak and Gabriel standing to the side of Barak with his hand on the creature, the 3 of them, according to Muhammad, flew through the air from Mecca to Jerusalem. And there they made a stop. There Muhammad encountered several Old Testament characters, prophets, including Joseph and Abraham and Aaron and others. Muhammad says that he had a conversation with these Old Testament figures, and that among other things, these individuals offered him a drink by offering him 2 bowls. One bowl was filled with wine, one bowl was filled with milk. Muhammad wisely and accurately and correctly selected the milk to drink. After their interchange, Muhammad claims that he once again, astride of Barak in the presence of Gabriel, that the 3 of them began to ascend through what the Quran calls the 7 heavens. About midway up, they encountered the same celestial prophets that they had encountered in Jerusalem, but now they appeared in their celestial state. And then after that encounter, they continued their ascent through the 7 heavens until they finally came to the 7th heaven. This, in fact, is identified in the Quran as the location of Allah. The Quran uses the expression, the lot tree of the uttermost end. Indeed, the very presence of Allah Himself. Muhammad says that Allah assigned to him a very specific responsibility that he was to in turn enjoin upon his followers. And that was that they were to engage in 50 prayers per day. Muhammad, of course, accepted the will of Allah and began to descend back down through the 7 heavens. About midway down, Muhammad encountered Moses. And if I might paraphrase the conversation, and I promise, I mean no disrespect, but in essence, Moses said, "So, what did God want?" And Muhammad said, "Well, He wants us to pray 50 prayers per day." Moses said, that's too many. You can't get people to pray that many prayers. You need to go back to Allah and ask for a reduction. Now, if Moses had told you to do that, what would you do? He reascended into the presence of Allah. And interestingly enough, Allah reduced the number of prayers to 40. Consequently, Muhammad began to descend once again through the seven heavens. Once again, he encountered Moses. Moses said, so what did he say? Muhammad said he reduced it to 40 prayers. Moses said, that's still too many. Your people are not spiritual enough to engage in that many prayers every day. You need to go back and ask for a reduction. I'm not making this up, and I mean no disrespect. But this continued to occur until finally Muhammad said Allah reduced the number of prayers to 5 prayers per day. Do you know that Moses said that is still too many prayers? But Muhammad said, I am ashamed and would be embarrassed to go back and ask for a reduction once again. Now, folks, according to Islam, that is the reason why Muslims to this day engage in 5 prayers per day. There is the source of that ritualistic practice. Muhammad says that he continued his descent through the 7 heavens and once reaching Jerusalem, flew back to Mecca. You know, in his day, 7th century, that would have been about a 2-month trip by camel caravan. But he says that he flew back and forth, all of this in one night, and then arrived back at his hometown of Mecca. Now, I can't help but have some questions about this. For example, why does a horse need wings, or whatever this creature was? Why would he need wings? And you say, well, obviously to fly. But see, that's a human concept. God doesn't have to put wings on anything to make it fly. This smacks of mythology, the kind of things that humans would conceive of. You know, according to the Bible, even angels do not have wings. They always appeared in the Old Testament in the form of adult males. The only exception to that would be the highly figurative apocalyptic section, for example, of Isaiah that speaks of the cherubim and the seraphim. They had like 3 pairs of wings, and that's figurative. But angels themselves are consistently in the Bible represented in male human form. And so for a horse to have wings, from the perspective of the God that is described and characterized in the Bible, that's somewhat clashing with the biblical concept of things, at least the portrait that the Bible gives of God. Another question is, why does this horse have a name? Why would you name a horse? Again, that's very common in mythology and in fables. But the notion of assigning a name to an animal, especially one that claims to be of a heavenly derivation, all of that seems, once again, to be very jarring with the perspective that is created from a biblical view of things. Another question. If Muhammad was to go into the presence of Allah and visit with God and receive information from God, why would he go from Mecca to Jerusalem and then go into heaven? Why not just go directly from Mecca to heaven? Is there something going on in Jerusalem where Muhammad needed to make his presence felt or known? Is there something about Jerusalem that you would want to include in a story in order to, bolster your credibility? In fact, why is it that he met up with Abraham and with Joseph and with others from the Old Testament? Is he wanting to identify himself with these individuals? You've heard the expression name dropper. I'm not saying for certain. I'm simply raising questions that these details seem to call forth by a person who's wanting to give an honest, fair evaluation of these circumstances. And then I can't help but ask the question, why, if you were allowed to go into the presence of Allah and to receive information from Him, why would the number of prayers be the topic? Now you say, well, why not? Well, why not any number of topics that are very spiritual? That's certainly one of them. Yes, it is. But think of all of the other important, critical teachings that a person would most certainly want to be apprised of. And if God decided, rather than merely giving His word through prophets, to actually bring someone into His presence and dispense to him a special bit of information, would it be the number of prayers? Why would it not be something like world evangelism? How about how to spread Islam worldwide? Or why would it not be something like how husbands and wives ought to treat each other, how families are to get along? Why would it not be something like how to feed the poor and be benevolent and care for other people? Do you remember the Bible gives us the incident involving the transfiguration of Jesus Christ in Matthew 17, where Jesus took 3 of His disciples, went up on a mountain, and there had an actual conversation, a conversant meeting with 2 major characters from the Old Testament. You know, the dean of the prophets, Elijah, and the ancient lawgiver, Moses himself. And they engaged in a conversation. Do you remember what the topic of their conversation was? Luke tells us. They talked about the impending, atoning sacrifice of Christ for the entire human race. Now that's a topic that's worthy of careful and special attention. But no, Muhammad went there to find out about the number of prayers. And then I can't help but ask, now wait a minute. Even if prayer would be the appropriate topic to discuss, why would the focus have to do with the number of prayers? The number of prayers. And why would God specify 50? Number one, why would He specify 50 if in fact that's virtually, physically impossible to perform? Because by the time you add all of the ritual ablutions, the call to prayer, all of these ritualistic activities associated with prayer, then you would end up pretty much spending your whole day going through the 50 prayers. You wouldn't have time to do any of the other things that God would have you to do, like making a living and taking care of your family and doing a host of other activities. So that's somewhat contradictory, shall we say, to the nature of God. God, are you saying that God would impose upon people 50 prayers and then be talked out of it? Talked down to 5? Does that sound like God? Is that not equivalent to God being asked, or God telling people, okay, here is what I want you to do to contact the blood of Christ? You know, in simple faith, believing that Jesus is the Son of God, and understanding my will, I want you to change your mind about your sin. That's repentance. I want you to orally confess Christ as the Son of God, and then I want you to be immersed in water. And so someone makes a trip to heaven, they visit with God, and they talk him out of that. And they say, well, God, you know, rather than being immersed, couldn't we instead just sprinkle some water on a person? And God says, well, okay. And then what if he comes back and says, well, God, rather than sprinkle, you know, water may not be available. Won't you allow us to instead maybe sprinkle dirt on a person? And God says, well, okay, yes. Folks, may I kindly and reverently suggest to you, that's not God. That's not the God of the Bible, not the infinite God who is infinite in all of His attributes and perfect in all of His attributes. That's not God. God would not enjoin something, and since He's omniscient, know that He's going to take it back and enjoin something else, take that back, enjoin something else, take that back. God wouldn't do that. If He wanted humans to give 5 prayers per day, then that's what He would have enjoined upon humans. He would not have altered and bartered over such a matter. That's not the nature of God. He doesn't do that in history. Someone says, oh, wait a minute, what about Abraham? Whenever Abraham asked God if there's, you know, at least 50 people in the city of Sodom, would He then spare the city? Didn't God barter with him? Yes, He did. Yes, He did. But that's a totally different situation. That doesn't have anything to do with what is required in order for a person to be saved or be pleasing or acceptable to God. That had to do with flexibility that God manifests on many areas of life. You know, God can choose to go this direction or that direction, and He may make the decision based on your behavior, which He knows ahead of time you're going to engage in. But can you not see that it's not in the nature of God to have regulations that He places upon humans? He wouldn't put any regulation upon a human that is not in and of itself appropriate, good, right. He wouldn't even begin to put such a regulation on a person. So if He puts it on a person, then He's going to expect that person to comply with it, and He will not then alter it. That's just not the way God operates. Consequently, may I suggest to you again kindly that any number of these events in the life of Muhammad, before we ever get to the Quran and discuss the characteristics of the Quran itself, even before we do that, we can't help but have great and grave questions about the legitimacy of Islam based upon the actions of the one who claims to be a bona fide, quintessential, and ultimate prophet of God. Notice then the three most holy sites in Islam: Mecca, where Muhammad was born; Medina, where Muhammad fled and made his home for the rest of his life; and Jerusalem, the location of the Dome of the Rock Mosque, where Muhammad claims to have made a trip into heaven. The third most holy site in Islam. As we bring this session to a close, may I suggest to you that now we will turn our attention to what is clearly the real thrust and purpose of our study. Everything that we have looked at up to this point has been purely introductory. I have given it to you for the purpose merely of informing you, broadening your understanding, giving you an overall sense of Islam and the history of Islam, the basic doctrines of Islam, who was Muhammad, what things occurred in his life. But in a sense, all of that is irrelevant. I do not believe we should determine whether we think a religion is authentic. That is, whether or not it is of supernatural origin, based upon what any individuals may do or not do, or any mistakes that people make. I would certainly not be pleased for people to make a decision about Christianity based upon the Crusades or the Spanish Inquisition or what other persons throughout the last 2,000 years have done in the name of Christ. All kinds of horrible atrocities inflicted upon mankind, all in the name of Christianity. That's not what determines the authenticity of that religion. What determines the authenticity of Islam? The Quran. Plain and simple, that's it. If the Quran if it possesses the attributes of inspiration, then it is the Word of God and we'd better listen to it. If it does not possess the attributes of inspiration, then it is originated by mere humans and does not merit our attention. We'll look at that in our next session together. If you appreciate this seminar on Islam and the Quran, you will want to read the book on which it was based, The Quran Unveiled. This volume gives a great deal of additional information not included in the DVD seminar. Also available are study guides that supplement your viewing of the DVD. The study guides, the book, as well as additional copies of the DVD may all be purchased at apologeticspress.org. or by calling toll-free 800-234-8558.
محمد رسول الله